So tonight I'm talking about a tale of two cities. And the two cities I'm talking about are specifically a little place called Gamla. I bet you no one in this audience has heard of Gamla. It's a little town up in the northern part of the Galilee, up above the Sea of Galilee, that Shelley and I visited when we were there. And it is a stand-in, later on in the talk tonight, for all the cities and all the towns and all the communities that the Romans utterly destroyed. And Gamla, they utterly destroyed it. The neat thing about Gamla is, after the Romans destroyed it, it was forgotten for 2 millennia. Until after the Jewish War, the Six-Day War in 1967, and the Jews excavated, I think in 68, I'm not sure when. So you can go back to Gamla today and you can see the way it was back then. Very interesting. City number 2 is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is, whenever we hear about the destruction of Jerusalem, that is the fall of the entire country. We always hear about Jerusalem falling in AD 70. Well, yes, it did. But it was a process starting in AD 66, going all the way up through AD 73, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on tonight. I'm also going to talk about, see if we can get this to work, a temple. I'm really going to talk about 3 different temples with 2 different names, just to keep things interesting and confusing. And I'm also going to talk about a fortress. Well, I'm really going to talk about several fortresses, and then we're going to tear it all down at the end of the lesson tonight. So the challenge for you is, I'm going to ask you after it's over with, what is the title of my lesson? Good luck. So first of all, let's talk about the Temple Mounts, the temples, and the fortresses of the Temple Mount. We'll go through this pretty quickly. So as this morning we talked about the valleys of Jerusalem, we talked about the mountains of Jerusalem. The main mountain of Jerusalem, Mount Moriah. That's where the temple stood. That's where the Dome of the Rock stands today. The Temple Mount is on Mount Moriah. The Temple Mount of today is the Herodian Temple Mount. It was the 3rd of 3 Temple Mounts. You can go walk where Jesus walked. You can go walk where the apostles walked. That's kind of cool. We did that when we were in Israel several years ago. Currently, the Muslim Dome of the Rock is on the very tippy top of Mount Moriah. If you go in the Dome of the Rock, if you're a Muslim, you can see the very top of Mount Moriah. I'll show you a picture of that as we go on in the lesson. So there are 3 Temple Mounts, 3 temples. They weren't all necessarily, they didn't line up with each other necessarily. And then there are a bunch of fortresses, 7 fortresses on the Temple Mount. So this is Jerusalem today. We talked about Jerusalem, the city, in our class this morning. Tonight we're going to talk about this chunk in yellow right here, the Temple Mount, about 37 acres worth. In Old Testament times, we had Solomon's temple. Everybody, the kids knew the answer to this, right? Solomon's temple was the first temple. Everybody knows Solomon built the first temple. And it was a fairly small, simple place. It was built in 967 and 960 BC, built on the spot that David bought. He bought the threshing floor of Aruna for 50 shekels of silver and bought the entire mountain for 600 shekels of gold a little bit later on. 142,000 animals were sacrificed on the Temple Mount on the day of the dedication, or the week of the dedication of the temple. 142,000 animals. Wrap your head about that, around that, and also remember that number as we go on, because we're going to compare that number, 142,000, to some other number as we go further in the lesson tonight. And this temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. There was also a square Temple Mount. We don't know who built it. Maybe Solomon, maybe as late as the rule of Hezekiah. But the square Temple Mount was 500 cubits on each side, which is 861 feet. That's kind of interesting because we'll see things on today's Temple Mount that you can go see that are traced back to Solomon's Temple Mount. That's pretty cool. So you can go up there and see these things. I will show you that in just a minute. So we don't know who did it. Lean Rittenmeyer, who's kind of the guru, he wrote a book called The Quest. And I took a lot of the information from my book out of his book, of course, reference to his book. But if you're interested in the nitty-gritty details of the temple, the temples, and the Temple Mount, and the current things on the Temple Mount, even down to the caves and the cisterns and that kind of thing, get his book called The Quest. But he thinks that the Temple Mount, the square Temple Mount, was built by Hezekiah during his reign. Now, if I go to the Temple Mount today, there's this step at the bottom of the Muslim raised platform. The Muslim raised platform was built when the Dome of the Rock was built, I think, in the 600s, late 600s AD. So relatively speaking, not that long ago, right? 1,500 years ago, whatever. But this Muslim platform is lined up with the western wall of Herod's Temple Mount. And that makes sense. Archaeologically, aesthetically, you want walls to line up, right? You don't want crooked walls in your house and whatever. So when they built this platform, they lined up this edge with the western wall, which is over here, of the Temple Mount. But this step is not lined up with that wall. Why? I'll tell you why. This step is exactly 500 cubits from the eastern wall of the Temple Mount, of the current Temple Mount. The eastern wall was shared, of the Temple Mount, was shared by Solomon's Temple Mount, the square Temple Mount, the Hasmonean Temple Mount we'll talk about in a few minutes, and then the Herodian Temple Mount. That same wall was shared by all three Temple Mounts. This step is lined up with that wall. That probably is the top of the wall of Solomon's Temple Mount, of the square Temple Mount. And you go stand on that today. Kind of cool. But again, it's not lined up with the edge of the Muslim platform. And I'll show you an upper view of that here in just a minute. So next up, the Tower of Hananel. Now, I'm not going to talk about the towers, the fortresses a lot, but as you read the Bible and you come across terms, for, in this case, the Tower of Hananel, you'll read about that in Jeremiah and Zechariah. I want you to be familiar with the terminology. All the forts of the Temple Mount were typically built on this northwestern corner. Remember this morning we talked about Jerusalem, how defensible it was on the eastern, western, and southern sides? Well, same with the Temple Mount. It was pretty defensible on these sides, but it was not defensible on this northern side. So the towers were typically built on the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. And we read about this in Jeremiah and Zechariah. This tower was likely destroyed when the temple was destroyed in 587. Between 587 and 535 BC, there was nothing up there except rubble. Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylonians, came in and destroyed everything in 587 BC, like the Romans did later on in 70 AD. Turns out Nebuchadnezzar destroyed on the same day that the Romans destroyed the temple, just a bunch of years apart. It's called Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, 9th of Av. Their Jewish month of Av is the saddest day in Jewish history because the temple was destroyed in 587 and it was destroyed in 70 AD, same day of their Jewish calendar. They go by lunar calendar, whereas we go by solar calendar. If you're interested in the kind of thing, you can go to my website and you can convert between these two different calendars in one of the calculators that I have there. Zerubbabel's temple. As we talked about this morning in the history lead up to all this that we're talking about tonight, we talked about at the end of the Old Testament was a renaissance for the Jews. Nehemiah had come back and rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem, right? Zerubbabel had come back and rebuilt the temple of Jerusalem. Ezra had rediscovered the law, and the Jews were kind of like a renaissance kind of thing. They were under the protection and auspices of the Persian government. Cyrus started out by letting them come back. He gave them money to come back, and then all the Persian kings continued that tradition on down through the years. Everything was good for the Jews, right? So Zerubbabel came back and built the temple, the second temple, which had been destroyed in 587 BC. He started in 535, completed 20 years later in 515 BC. There were 712 animals sacrificed during this temple dedication, compared to, what's the number? 142,000 versus 712. Many of the old people who had seen the first house, Solomon's temple and its foundations, wept with a loud voice. Zerubbabel's temple was not anything like Solomon's temple. I mean, just look at the difference in the dedication of the animals. It was good to have a temple, but it wasn't like the good old days. We talk about that, don't we? The good old days. Well, same thing for them. The good old days was when the temple existed under Solomon. There's a bunch of stuff in the temple that was no longer there. The Ark of the Covenant that was in the Holy of Holies, no longer there. The cherubim, no longer there. Some of the vessels, Cyrus, if he had them, he allowed them to come back to Jerusalem. But the Ark of the Covenant disappeared. We don't know where it went. I guess go watch Raiders of the Lost Ark and find out. I guess that's all I need to say about that. Next up, the towers of Hananel and the 100. We'll read about these in Nehemiah. located on the same northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. During the Intertestament, we have another fortress called the Ptolemaic Acra. Again, some of these fortresses were just kind of like rebuilding, rededicating, renaming. So same thing here. The Ptolemaic Acra, only because the Ptolemies, remember the history from this morning? The Ptolemies controlled Jerusalem and Cold Syria during this time. So when they controlled it, they named their fort the Ptolemaic Acra. Next up, the Seleucid Acra. Now I just told you, and you're thinking I'm lying to you, but I just told you that these three sides were very defensible, and this side was not. That's why the fortresses were always built on the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. Why did the Seleucids build a fortress on the southern end of the Temple Mount? Well, the reason was it wasn't a fortress to keep people out, it was a fortress to watch the Jews. This fortress was built higher than the Temple Mount, it was built higher than the lower city, it was built higher than the upper city. The Seleucids could stand in their Seleucid fortress and look down on the Jews, and the Jews didn't like this a bit. It was a thorn in their side. Next up, when the Hasmoneans took over, remember the history? The Maccabees came and under Papa Mattathias, and Judas Maccabeus the Hammer. They in the Maccabean revolt, and then the Hasmoneans. During the Hasmonean dynasty, the Hasmonean Bears came about. Basically the Ptolemaic Acra, they just kind of took it over and renamed it. But you will read about that in the Intertestament history. And then the Seleucid Acra was destroyed by the Maccabees. It was a thorn in their side, right? So they got rid of it. So the easiest thing to do, when I go and remodel my house, I have to either put a little bit in the trash can at a time or take it out to the street and they'll come get it or whatever. Back in the day, what did you do with all the rubble when you destroyed something? Well, the Hasmoneans decided to dump it into this new extension of the Temple Mount they made. So this extension was the Hasmonean extension built from rubble of the Seleucid Acra. Kind of cool. Next up, the First Antonia Fortress. Herod the Great took over Jerusalem in 37 BC, and he enhanced really the fortress that was there. So remember, it was the Hasmonean Bears. When Herod the Great took over, he renamed it the Antonia Fortress after his benefactor Mark Antony of Rome. Okay, and notice that it's built on the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount, the square Temple Mount again. Okay. In New Testament times, everything changed. We have a new temple. Herod the Great built this temple. Herod the Great was a smart guy. And you can argue with me all day about how bad he was. Yes, he was a bad guy. He was an evil man, but he was smart. He was politically brilliant. And one thing he did when he decided to build this temple is he promised that I'm going to build you a temple. He would tell the Jews this. He would tell the priests this. I'm going to build you a temple. And they would say, yeah, but what if you don't? What if you're just talking big? And what if you're really not going to build a temple? He said, I'll tell you what. I'm going to pay for it with my own money. He's very rich, obviously. I'll pay for it with my own money, and I will gather all the supplies ahead of time, and I will park them on the Temple Mount up there, and I will train 1,000 of you priests to be able to build this temple. Before we even start doing a thing, we're going to do all that. I'm going to get the supplies, I'm going to pay for them, and I'm going to train you to build. And the priest said, okay, good plan, let's go along with that. And they did. So this really is kind of the third temple, but it's really named the second temple because it really is just it's like remodeling your house. It was a pretty major remodeling, but it's really the Zerubbabel's temple with a new facelift, right? But it was a very impressive facelift that Herod the Great did. Next up, Herod decided to do his own Temple Mount expansion. He extended the walls to the north, the west, and the south. If you go to Jerusalem today and you want to see where these Temple Mounts are, you can find them. You can see those very easily. If I stand on the top, and I didn't do this, I've just read about it, but if you stand on the top of the Temple Mount wall and look down the wall, you'll see that there's a little bend in the wall. And that's where the Hasmonean extension begins. Now, that's not the current stones that are on the Temple Mount today, but they're down in the foundation. When they built new stones upon old stones and then new stones upon old stones, and they got destroyed and whatever, So this all goes down to the foundation, but there's that little 1.12 degree bend in the wall there. That's a delineation between where the Hasmoneans built their temple extension from where the square Temple Mount was. For Herod's Temple Mount, there's something called the seam. You can actually go up to that today and you can touch it, you can see it. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. Also notice that the gates line up. Herod's Temple Mount gates line up directly with the Hasmonean gates and the Solomon era gates, the square Temple Mount gates. Same thing for the triple gate. You can go see those gates today. You walk up the southern stairs of the Temple Mount to the Temple Mount, and you can see those gates today. They're blocked in, but you can see where the gates were, the big double gate and the big triple gate over here. Pretty cool. Those gates, if they were not blocked in, you would be able to walk through those and walk through the Hasmonean gate, you'd be underground basically, and then you'd pop out on top of the Temple Mount where the old gates were of Solomon's Temple Mount, of the square Temple Mount. The gate names shown here are modern-ish names. Back in the 1800s, when the British controlled Palestine, they sent all kinds of explorers out, and they were able to dig around in the good old days. We can't do that today on the Temple Mount. We can't dig around up there. But they were able to dig around, and they would go underground and explore, and they found all these gates. There's Warren's Gate, Wilson's Arch, Barclay's Gate, Robinson's Arch. I'm going to show you some of these pictures of these things that exist today when you go to Jerusalem. The eastern gate over here is the only one, and again, it's not the original stones, but it's the only gate that is shared, at least down to the foundation, for all three Temple Mounts. All the rest of the gates were covered up by extensions, right? Herod's extension covered everything else up except for the eastern wall of the square Temple Mount. There we go. The second Antonia fortress was built by Herod, again, named after his benefactor Mark Antony of Rome, on the extended Herodian Temple Mount on the northwest corner, like every other fortress was. Now, if you go to Jerusalem today and tromp around on the Temple Mount, you can. You go through one gate you're allowed to go through, the Mugrabi Gate, and you go up there and tromp around the Temple Mount. Where you're tromping is the Herodian Temple Mount. That area that is up there is the same as what Herod built 2,000 years ago. That's kind of cool when you go do that. The temple? No. In New Testament times, there was no temple in New Testament times. This today is the Dome of the Rock. It is a Muslim institution. It's a Muslim shrine. It's not a mosque. The mosque is right here. It's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But the shrine, the Dome of the Rock, sits over the foundation stone, the very tippy top of Mount Moriah. You can't go in there. We tried. I told you this morning, the little guy in the chair sitting outside said, no, you can't go in. You have to be Muslim to go into the shrine, the Dome of the Rock. And when I was writing the book, I had trouble finding pictures of what the top of the rock looked like, but I did finally find one and put it in the book. But as you look at this wall of the Temple Mount, we see the bend right here. And again, you can't see that in the stonework. You can't see because it's all interwoven, but it's down to the foundation. But you see the little bend right here. So to the right of that bend is Solomon era foundation. In between here is Hasmonean era foundation. And to the left is Herodian era foundation and stones. You can actually see Hasmonean stones here at the bend, at the seam rather, and you can see Herodian stones at the other end of the seam. Right here is the seam. Herodian masonry over here, Hasmonean masonry over here. You can go up and touch that if you want to. Nobody's ever there. I mean, you just go up and do whatever you want to on the outside of the Temple Mount walls. They don't care too much about what goes on down at the bottom of the Temple Mount. They do care a lot about what goes on the Temple Mount. The Muslims are very strict about how they let you behave up there. This is a picture of what the southwest corner of the Temple Mount looked like back in the day, back in Jesus' day. There was a giant staircase that went up from the lower city of Jerusalem to the royal stoa on the south side of the Temple Mount. This arch, these stones coming out, is called Robinson's Arch. Edward Robinson found those in the 1800s, the late 1800s. I don't remember exactly when. But we can see those today, and I'll show you a picture of those here in just a minute. So these stones, you know, they carried the weight of this giant staircase that went up here. Also over here, we have Barclay's Gate. All the gates, all the ancient gates are all covered up. They're all stoned in because they're not used anymore. Barclays Gate, you can go, if you're a woman, you can go up and touch Barclays Gate where it is, because it is in the women's prayer area of the Western Wall. If you're a man, not so much. But if you're a man, you can go over here and you can see Wilson's Arch. Women can't see that one. So, we kind of get, it's kind of fair one way or the other, I guess. So anyway, notice on this southern wall down here, this staircase. You can't see it in the picture, but there are arches under the staircase where there were merchants, selling animals, maybe doing money changing, I don't know, whatever was going on down there. But just keep that in mind. On the southern wall of the Temple Mount, there's these arches under this stairway. And this stairway goes up to the double and triple gates. You can go up the double and triple gates today, and again, they're filled in. You can't go through them, but you can see where they were. Something tells me I probably need to be closer to this to make this work. But there we go. Now I've gone out. Let's go back. Okay. That's what I get for pressing the button 17 times. Okay. The Temple Mount in AD 70. Nothing. Like the Temple Mount after Nebuchadnezzar came along, the Romans were brutal. They didn't just destroy things, they leveled everything. They pushed all the stones off the Temple Mount onto the street below. The Jews, after the Six-Day War, excavated down to the Roman street. This is it. Everyone, when they go to Jerusalem and Israel, they have kind of a different experience. Some people, they go out on the Sea of Galilee on a boat, and they think that's the neat experience for me. For me, it was kind of going on the Temple Mount and standing where the porch of the temple likely was, and just wandering around the Temple Mount, just kind of like, that was really cool to me. Shelley, her thing was walking on this street. She said, that street could be where Jesus and the apostles walked. That's pretty cool. Well, the Jews, when they excavated after the war, they excavated down to the street here, but they decided to leave all the boulders from the Temple Mount above that the Romans pushed over the wall. It was total destruction. This is Robinson's Arch right here. Hard to see, I know. So this woman is standing pretty much on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount in front of Robinson's Arch, and then we see the various gates up there. Yay. All right. The Temple Mount today, it's known as the Haram al-Sharif. It's a Muslim-controlled piece of land. As I mentioned this morning, it's controlled by the Muslim Waqf. The Waqf is under the auspices of the Jordanian government. They control civilly what goes on the Temple Mount. The Jews, the Israelis, have security control on the Temple Mount. As I mentioned this morning, if you go to the Temple Mount today, you need to plan around it. The hours are very limited, but you don't wear shorts. Women, you need to cover your shoulders, probably your head. You don't hold hands. You certainly don't kiss your spouse. You don't pray. You don't carry a Bible. There's a lot of things you need to be aware of if you go to the Temple Mount today. You can go. It's completely safe. Well, it's mostly safe to go, depending on the time of year or the time of the whatever wars are going on or whatever. But it's a pretty safe place to go. You just need to follow the rules when you do go. Don't do those things and some others that I'm not remembering right now. But the current Temple Mount today has the Dome of the Rock, the gold domed Muslim shrine. It has the Muslim raised platform. Notice the purple Muslim raised platform is parallel to the western wall of the Temple Mount. Archaeologically or aesthetically, that's what you want to see, right? When you build a house, like I say, you want to have your walls kind of parallel. So when they built the Muslim platform, it was parallel to this wall. The step here that I talked about just a minute ago, this step that leads up to the Muslim platform is actually parallel to this wall, the eastern wall. And not only is it parallel, it's 500 cubits away, 861 feet, I believe it is. That's kind of cool. So we do really believe, not I, but in the research that I've done, I believe that step that I showed you really is probably the top wall of Solomon's Temple Mount. And that's pretty cool that you can go see that. The modern day gates are shown here in blue. The only gate you and I can go into is the McGroby Gate down here in the southwest corner, close to Robinson's Arch, actually really close to Barclay's Gate. Any other gate, if you're Muslim, you can go in and out of, no problem. You can go out of any gate if you're a Christian, Jew, whatever, but you can only go in one gate, and you go up a long wooden platform, bridge thing to get up there. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. You can't see much, but at least I'll show you a picture of it. The Dome of the Rock today, or the Temple Mount today, is a very hotly contested piece of real estate. Shelley was standing at the lower end of the raised platform, and I was standing on the top of the raised platform, and she took my picture. The Dome of the Rock in the background, the Dome of the Chain in the foreground, and there, I notice I'm dressed pretty conservatively. I'm just dressed head to toe in whatever garb. The Dome of the Chain, I mentioned this morning, is probably the location of the porch of the temples. Oh, that's pretty cool. You can go stand there today that other people in the New Testament were not allowed to do. You had to be a priest to be able to stand on the porch of the temple. Jesus wasn't able to do that. The apostles weren't able to do that. But you can do that today because that's likely the location of the porch of the temple. If you go to now from the top of the Temple Mount, we're now down to the bottom of the Temple Mount at the western wall. It used to be called the Wailing Wall back in my early days. I don't see that in the literature much anymore. It's just called the Western Wall. And this is where Jews go to pray, but it's not limited to Jews. The Jews are very lax in letting Christians, Jews, Muslims, whoever come up and pray or do whatever at the Western Wall. I mean, you still need to be respectful of things that are going on, but you can go and touch the stones there. And those stones you're touching are Herodian stones. Herod the Great commissioned those stones to be laid. The first 7 courses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, these are Herodian stones. So if you go up and you have a prayer slip you want to stick in the wall or whatever, when you go up, you're touching Herodian stones. That's pretty cool. But it's not the stones probably that Jesus and the apostles touched, because there's an additional 17 courses underground, which go down 43 feet. If you want to go see those, you can. There's something called the Western Wall Tunnel. And you can walk. They dug out underneath the Temple Mount, the Jews did, and you buy a ticket, and you start at one end, and you can walk the entire length underground of the Western Wall, and you can see these giant foundation stones of the Temple Mount. One, I think, is 42 feet wide. How they move that in place, I have no idea. I mean, there's theories on how it was done, but I really have no idea how they would move something that big, and I mean, the weight of that thing had to have been tons and tons and tons. But you can do that today on the Western Wall Tunnel. So, this morning we looked at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem from over the Mount of Olives, really. But now we're looking at the eastern wall of Jerusalem and Temple Mount. Tonight we're looking at the western wall of the Temple Mount. And you see a bunch of neat things here that I've already talked about. Starting on the very right-hand corner, there's Robinson's Arch. Remember, that's what held the giant staircase that went up to the temple, to Solomon's porch. Or the royal stoa, actually. Next up, this is the rubble from the destruction, right here. That's the picture I took a minute ago. This is the giant ramp that leads up to the McGroby Gate, where you and I can go to the Temple Mount today. You go through Israeli security here, and they check your bags and everything, make sure you don't have any bombs or weapons or whatever, and you can either go to the western wall, or you can go to the Temple Mount if it's open. In the Western Wall Plaza, this larger area here is for men. The smaller area here is for women. Barclay's Gate is right here at the very right end of the women's prayer area. So I was not able to go actually see that, but I do have a picture of that in the book. Wilson's Arch is right here on the left side of the men's prayer area. Wilson's Arch supported a giant bridge. Now remember, on the lower side, we had a giant staircase down here at Robinson's Arch. But Wilson's Arch supported a giant bridge going from the upper city of Jerusalem to the Temple Mount. That's what the priest would have used, and the rich people, the haughty-taughty people of Jerusalem. They would use this bridge going over Wilson's Arch that you can see today in Jerusalem, to the very left here of the prayer area. This is the Western Wall Tunnel. Goes the entire length of the Western Wall underground. The step that I talked about, the top of Solomon's Temple Mount wall, the square Temple Mount wall, is right here. it's lined up precisely with the eastern wall of Jerusalem, not lined up with the western wall. So that's a little bit of a clue. Okay. The Golden Gate here is the only gate that was shared by all three Temple Mounts, not the gate that's there today necessarily, but the foundation. The foundations are really the same for the Golden Gate through all the successive Temple Mounts. The mosque is here, of course, the Dome of the Rock is here. The temple. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the temples. I'm going to talk about just Herod's temple. If you've not had a chance to go out and see the displays in the back, please do so afterwards. And one thing that I have back there is this temple model. There's a guy, Scott Schneider, who he and I kind of do email back and forth now, but he put this kit together, very well done. And you just basically get this kit of 6 million pieces and you start gluing things together according to his very well done directions. Now, I changed this. I actually added tile, real tile in here in the women's court and then this priest court back here. And then I put it on a plywood board. So I did a little more enhancements to it than he had in his kit. Another thing that I added was this wall here. This was called the Soreg. And this surrounded the Temple Mount, not the Temple Mount, but the temple complex completely. The Soreg was meant to keep you out. If you're a Gentile, you can't go across the Soreg. It's about 5 feet tall, probably about here. So I could stand there as a Gentile and look over the Soreg and see things going on in the temple, see stuff going on in the women's court, see stuff going on with the animal sacrifices or whatever happened to be going on. But I could not go in there upon penalty of death. The Jews were very serious about this. So they had a weeding out process, if you will. So the Soreg weeded out Gentiles, kept them outside. Only Jews, Jewish men and women and children could go in up to this area here called the women's court. A little bit of a misnomer. People think that's, well, only women could go there. It's not true. Anybody could go there if you're a Jew. That's the last place the women could go. You can then go up some steps if you're a man and go in through the Nicanor gate into the court of the Israelites. That's where men could go. Jewish men could go. It's a pretty narrow area, but they could go and see the temple rites going on. Take a couple of steps up, I think, and a rail or something, and then you get into the priest area back here where only priests were allowed. And of course, only one person was allowed one time a year inside here, the Holy of Holies, on Yom Kippur. The high priest was allowed in there once a year. So this is the inscription that's found. A full inscription is the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. A partial inscription is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. But it says basically, if you enter past this thing, past this Soreg, you will be killed if you're not a Jew. They were serious about it. This is my depiction of Herod's temple. If you go to the literature, you'll see 10,000 depictions of the temple. Now, some of it we know exactly what's going on. The Mishnah is very clear about the Holy of Holies, the size, the holy place, how big it was, where the altar and the laver. So any of these dimensions, you know, that looks kind of close altogether to me, but that's precisely what the Mishnah says are the dimensions of these things apart from each other. Okay? But stuff out here, we don't really know where things were back then. So we have to do some educated guesses. The women's court, the treasure chests were likely in the women's court. Remember the widow and her 2 mites? Well, there's a whole discussion in the book on what mites really are and what they're really not. It's just a translation error, basically, in the King James Version. But the women's, or not the women's, but the treasure chests were in the women's court. The different chambers, the chamber of lepers, wood, Nazarites, and oil were here. When you get to the court of Israelites where the men could go, and then 3 steps up, I believe it was, you get into the court of priests, and then only priests could go back here, and of course only the high priest in the Holy of Holies one time a year, Yom Kippur. And the Holy of Holies in Herod's temple, completely empty. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant didn't return, the cherubim didn't return. All the implements inside the Holy of Holies were gone. We don't know where they went. So when the priest went in there on Yom Kippur every year, he would sprinkle blood on the stone, just on the foundation stone. Nothing else to sprinkle the blood on. The chamber of hewn stone is where the Sanhedrin met. The Sanhedrin was the Supreme Court of the Jews' days. So Jesus probably had his 4th trial, I believe it was, of his 6 trials, probably in the chamber of hewn stone here. You see that depicted in different places. Some people depict it up here. In Scott's model, the model you'll see back there, the chamber of hewn stone is shown up here. That's a little subtle difference, but if you look at the model, you'll see that he has decided that it was probably up on the northern side of the temple. We just don't know. Another cool thing about this is the hell. It's called the terrace, the sacred terrace called the hell, H-E-L. Outside the sacred terrace, there were two chambers, a mikveh, which is a bath, so priests could come in and bathe themselves, getting ready for the rituals they were going to do in the temple that day or whatever, or Yom Kippur or whatever it was. And there was also a chamber for defiled altar stones. Remember this morning we talked about that the Maccabees, when they came along, they rededicated the temple in 164 BC, Judas Maccabees. And they tore down the altar stones that had been defiled because the Seleucids had offered a pig on those stones, and that was a no-no to the Jews. So they tore this altar down, and what do you do? I mean, it's kind of still sacred, right? Kind of, sort of. You can't just throw them out in the Kidron Valley, but they're defiled. So what do you do? Well, they decided we'll store them outside the sacred terrace. We'll store them outside the hell, but we'll still keep them on the grounds of the temple, even though they're outside the sacred terrace. I think that's kind of cool. The foundation stone. If you go in the Dome of the Rock today, if you could, this is what you'll see. The very tippy top of Mount Moriah. This is likely where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac, where the Muslims believe Abraham almost sacrificed Ishmael. It's where the Holy of Holies likely was. If you read The Quest, the book I was talking about earlier, Lean Rittenmeyer believes he's found the place where the Holy of Holies sat. I mean, the Ark of the Covenant sat in the Holy of Holies. It's kind of cool, a little chiseled out piece of stone on top of the mountain there. But you can't go see it. And again, when I was writing the book, this is about the only picture that I could find, a black and white picture that I put in the book. Now, what we've done this morning is build the city of Jerusalem. What we've done this evening up to this point is build the Temple Mount. And now we're going to talk about tearing it all down. And again, I mentioned to you, we're talking about two different cities. Gamla, up in the Galilee region. You have to go past the burned out Syrian tank. There literally is a burned out Syrian tank on the way up to Gamla. And I was going to take a picture of it when I came back down that way, but we ended up going home a different way, or back to Jerusalem a different way. Not to Jerusalem, but Tiberias. But anyway, Gamla is a stand-in for all the little towns and communities that the Romans completely destroyed in their lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem itself. And then, of course, we have Jerusalem that we're going to talk about in quite a bit of detail. From the birth of Jesus until the destruction of Jerusalem, there were three main groups of people that were in charge. The Herodians, of course, Herod the Great, his sons, grandsons, etc. The prefects, and the procurators. The prefects, the most famous of those is Pontius Pilate. If you're a Christian, we're very familiar with Pontius Pilate and his role in what he did with the crucifixion of Jesus, right? If you're a Bible student, the most famous of the procurators, Felix and Festus, right? Because we see their interactions with Paul, the apostle, for example, okay? Felix and Festus. If you're a historian, if you're interested in the destruction of Jerusalem, the most famous of the procurators is probably Gessius Florus, who ruled from AD 64 to AD 66. We'll talk about him in a minute. He was a bad guy. This chart, I know you can't see. I've got a poster of it back there if you're interested in the details. But across the top of this poster are the different regions. 9 different regions, 8 of which we're mostly interested in: Judea, Samaria, Idumea, etc. Herod the Great ruled all these regions from 37 BC when he conquered Jerusalem to 4 BC when he died. When he died, the regions were broken up among his 3 sons. Herod Archelaus took the main regions: Judea, Samaria, Idumea. His son Philip took these regions, and his son Antipas took these regions. Herod Archelaus was a bad dude. He was so bad that the Jews actually convinced the Roman Emperor Augustus to depose him, and he was banished in AD 6. And what the Romans decided to do in AD 6 was combine these 3 regions, Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, into one region, a Syrian province called Iudea. Has anyone ever heard of Iudea? Or Judea? That's our pronunciation today. Judea was a combination of these 3 regions into one, Judea, Iudea. They also put prefects in charge. As we mentioned, Pontius Pilate was the most famous of the prefects. As time went on and these sons died out or they were deposed or whatever, there's a little brief history there when it was added to the Syrian province, but Herod Agrippa I came along, the grandson of Herod the Great. And he took over, first of all, took over these 3 regions in AD 37. He added these regions in 39, and then he finally added these final three regions, or one, Iudia, in AD 41. So Herod Agrippa I ruled all the same regions that his grandfather had ruled, Herod the Great had ruled. That's kind of cool. But of course, everybody dies. So Herod Agrippa I died in AD 44. When he died, the Romans decided to put the procurators in charge of all the regions. Again, the most famous that we know, Felix Festus, Gessius Florus, I'm going to talk to you about tonight, and Albinus. We'll also talk about him. So when they put him in charge, these people in charge of these regions, they were in charge of all the regions until a man named Herod Agrippa II came along, the great-grandson of Herod the Great, and he took over kind of stepwise like his father had done. He took over these regions in 53. He took over this region in 54 and part of this region in 54, but he never took over Iudia. If he had, Jerusalem probably would have never fallen. The Jews would not have had an excuse to go to war against Rome. If he had, he was very good to the Jews, and the Jews would have been okay with Roman rule, probably. But the Romans chose not to put that Iudia under Herod Agrippa II. If they had, things would have been way different. We might be able to go see the temple today. We might be able to go to the Temple Mount and stand outside the Soreg and look inside the temple grounds. But because they didn't put him in charge and they put the procurators in charge, Rome came in and crushed Jerusalem later. Now, I encourage you, I know there's a lot of detail here that you cannot see. I encourage you to go back there and look at the chart. If you're interested in this kind of thing, go back and look at the poster that I have back there. So the history leading up to the fall of Jerusalem is this. We had Felix and Albinus, two fairly evil people. Felix had a high priest, Jonathan, killed, and he had a bunch of Jews killed. Felix wasn't allowed to do that, even though he's a procurator. If Herod Agrippa had wanted to kill the priest, that would have been okay. You know, that's not fine, because the priest was appointed by, at that time, Herod Agrippa. In my book, I've got a table of all the high priests in the back in one of the appendices, and I have a listing of who appointed that particular high priest. Well, at this particular time, Herod Agrippa was in charge of appointing the high priest. So he could depose, he could kill, he could do whatever he wanted to do to the high priest, but the procurator was not allowed to do that. But he did. He killed Jonathan. He killed a bunch of Jews in Caesarea. He was just kind of a bad guy. We do know about him in the Bible. And he's the one that kind of kept putting Paul off, Albinus was the next bad dude. Josephus tells us, tremendous historian, interesting historian, very interesting life. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Josephus tells us there was not any sort of wickedness that could be named that Albinus had a hand in. He was bad. He executed all the prisoners who were bad, who had done serious crimes, and he let everybody else out of prison who would give him money. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on, cycles of history. Some of this is going on today in the U.S. Some of this lacks on criminal stuff going on in some of these bigger cities. Some of that's going on today. The more things change, the more things that stay the same. So, those two procurators, bad guys. Next up, Gessius Florus. He was so bad that the Jews considered Albinus a good guy compared to Florus. He brought on Judea an abundance of miseries and did his utmost notions to the harm of the nation after a pompous manner. He stole 17 talents from the temple. How much is 17 talents? Does anybody know? No, I bet nobody knows. Well, you go to my website and you can punch it in and you can see how much 17 talents is. When I punch it in my website, it comes out about $9 million. And I explain my methodology of how I come up with that number. And you can agree with that or not agree with that. You can plug in different numbers and change that if you want. But it was millions of dollars for sure. Could be $5 million, could be $20 million, I don't know. But I do explain the methodology that I use. And the methodology that I use, it was $9 million. A lot of money. There was a massive crime wave under his watch. He was so bad the Jews considered Albinus a good guy. Even Bernice, the sister of Agrippa II, petitioned Florus, and she was afraid for her life. The sister of the king was afraid for her life because of this man, this evil man, Gessius Florus. He wanted the Jews to go to war. And the reason was that all the bad things that he did, well, if you're in a war, you kind of don't think about the bad things that he did, right? You got really more immediate things. You got to kill the Roman that's in front of you, but without worrying about that he stole 17 talents of money back here. We don't care because we got a war to fight. So he wanted the Jews to go to war with the Romans, and he got his wish. The Jews ended up fighting amongst themselves. The Jews and the Romans were fighting. The Syrians and the Jews were fighting, and it was a mess. Every city was divided into 2 armies, and it talks about the dead men in the street, the old men, mixed in with the babies, mixed with infants, all dead. Things were so bad that Rome finally called in a man named Cassius Gallus in AD 66. Gallus was a Syrian governor at the time. See if we can get this to work. Of course, I press it 18 times. We'll go 18 slides in. There we go. I know you can't read this, probably, but I've enhanced a couple of these bullets at the bottom. So when the Romans went and took all of Judea, Iudaea, their main base of operations was here in Caesarea. So every chart that I show, you'll see them fanning out from Caesarea and going and doing their Roman things. Gallus was no different. He started out in Caesarea, took some cities here and there, and then came down to Jerusalem and besieged it. And then for unknown reasons, I've not found any reasons in the literature, for some unknown reason, in AD 66, in October, he broke off the siege. Weird. But the Jews said, ha ha, we have him now. Oh, I can see the Star Wars analogy, we have him now. And the Jews went out and attacked Gallus, and they pursued him and destroyed much of his army. My question is, what if Gallus had succeeded in AD 66? The temple would probably still be there. Probably 1 million Jews' lives would have been saved. As much as that, as awful as that is, if he had killed a bunch now, it probably would have saved another 1 million later on if he had succeeded. But he didn't. He broke it off, and then Vespasian, the very famous Roman general and soon-to-be emperor, was appointed to take over the destruction of the region. In AD 67, Vespasian took over, and again, starting in Caesarea over here on the coast, he started going out. Most of this, he did a couple of cities, 3 cities down on the coast, but most of his activity was up here in the Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee. We're interested in Gamla. Gamla is in the very tippy top of the Sea of Galilee, and you can drive up there today, and we did. We actually went up there and we stopped to kind of look out over it's a higher level, the Golan Heights, right? Golan Heights is a higher level. So we stopped under a tree to look out over the Sea of Galilee and the hills and stuff, which is pretty cool. And I looked down, and you didn't expect to see a picture of gravel, right? So I looked down and I thought, I'm going to take a picture of that gravel. That's kind of cool. Well, that's not gravel. We were parked under an olive tree. Gamla was known for its very high quality olive oil. And there's olive trees all over the place up there. We had stopped under an olive tree to get a little shade and a little rest. So Gamla sat on a hill that looked like the back of a camel. See the back of the camel there? In fact, Gamla, it means camel, or camel's hump. Gamal in Hebrew. This area where I'm standing here, where I took this picture, I put the page numbers in the book, by the way, if you have a book, if you want to look. I'm standing at the place where Vespasian likely stood when he was surveying Gamla. This is a recreation of one of the implements of war that the Romans used to take Gamla. Gamla was built such that the porch of one house was the roof of the next house, and the porch of this house was the roof of the next house, because all everything was built on this slope here. When the Jews were there in Gamla and the Romans came in to take over, all these houses started collapsing. The weight of the Roman soldiers climbing up, they just started collapsing, one on top of the other, just one right after the other. And so many people were killed because of the collapsing of these roofs. Well, Gamla really is just a stand-in for what the Romans did everywhere in Iudaea. They just destroyed everything. So when we think about the destruction of Jerusalem, it's not just the destruction of Jerusalem. It's the destruction of a bunch of other people, killing a bunch of other people, taking a bunch of other people as slaves. It was bad, and they were very methodical. Vespasian was very methodical about it. By the way, let me go back and tell you something there about Gamla. Gamla was set up by a man named Josephus to be the main stronghold of the Golan Heights of the Galilee. Josephus was a Jewish commander of the Galilee. Now, you've probably heard the name Josephus in your studies or whatever, in talks, sermons, whatever. So Josephus was first a commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee, and he transformed into eventually the spokesman for the Romans when they destroyed Jerusalem. I don't have time to tell you that story tonight, but it's an interesting story, how he transformed from a Jewish general, commander, to a Roman spokesman when Jerusalem fell. Rome's campaign of AD 68, Vespasian, again starting in Caesarea. He pretty much covered all the Galilee at this point, so he started working south, started taking cities south. Notice he's not going to Jerusalem yet, because Jerusalem right here, because he's working, taking the countryside. Again, when you think of the destruction of Jerusalem, you think the Roman armies came in, they took Jerusalem, everybody went home. That's not the case at all. They took everything first, and then they took Jerusalem last in AD 70. AD 69, you see the activity is lessening now because he's not quite ready to take Jerusalem. That's going to happen the next year. But Vespasian ended up becoming emperor in 69 AD. It's called the Year of the Four Emperors. Ask me how it went for the first three of those four emperors. It didn't go so well. But Vespasian came along, number 4 of those 4 emperors, and he established the dynasty that lasted for quite a few years after that. He ruled for many, many years. So Vespasian became emperor. He left his son Titus to clean up and finally take Jerusalem. In AD 70, that's what he did. Titus brought along 4 regions, the 5th, the 10th, the 12th, the 15th. There were a bunch of Jews in Jerusalem for Passover at the time. He brought his legions from various places, camped them outside Jerusalem, and they started their work. This is what the Romans did. I mean, if you have a job description of the Romans, that's what they did. They took cities. Jerusalem was no different. Josephus became the chief negotiator with the Jews. It was very personal to him. His wife was in Jerusalem. His mother was in Jerusalem. I'm sure many members of his family are in Jerusalem. He would go outside the walls in Jerusalem and he'd plead with them and say, please, this is not going to end well with you. And it wasn't because the people were saying, oh, well, we don't care. We're going to fight the Romans anyway. We don't care if we're killed. They weren't saying that. It was the zealots that were saying that. I could spend an entire lesson just on the zealots and because of them, Jerusalem fell from within before the Romans even stepped foot in the city. There were different factions of zealots fighting each other. John of Giscala, Eleazar was another one. Simon was another one. So these factions of zealots were fighting each other, but they had one common goal when it came to the people of Jerusalem. We don't care about the people of Jerusalem. They would steal their food and eat their food, and they would kill people who didn't want to be killed and let people live who wanted to be killed. They were just not nice people. It was so bad that a woman boiled her child, her baby, and ate that baby. They were scavenging in the sewers and stuff for food. Things were bad in Jerusalem because of the zealots. The zealots would not let people leave Jerusalem. Even if you said, okay, Rome, I'll be a slave. Take me off of the salt mines or whatever. I don't care. I don't want to go through this, whatever. Well, the zealots wouldn't let them. So Jerusalem fell from within before the Romans even set foot in. The destruction of Jerusalem, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, as I mentioned before, the same day that the temple fell in 587 with Nebuchadnezzar. Order of events. Now we covered the city of Jerusalem, all these walls, the first wall here, the second wall, the third wall. So the third wall was the outer wall at this time. So the third wall was the first wall breached. This is Josephus' terminology, if you go and read his description of the destruction of Jerusalem. So this was first of all breached. They took the new cities. And these are where the legions camped, the 5th, 12th, 15th. Their second camp, they were out here first, and then they moved into the city after they breached the walls. And then the 10th Legion was out here. Next up, they breached the second wall. They then did a couple of unsuccessful attacks on the Antonia Fortress and on the first wall, and they were rebuffed. So the Romans said, that's okay. Let's step back for a minute and let's build a siege wall around the city of the part they didn't control. This was really twofold. This was to keep people in and keep people out. Enforcements couldn't come and bring food or whatever, and people that wanted to escape, even if the zealots let them escape, they couldn't escape because of the siege wall. So that kept people in. Anyone that tried to cross a siege wall would be killed by the Romans. Okay. Next up, the Antonia Fortress was taken. Once they took the Antonia Fortress, it was pretty easy to go and take the Temple Mount. Once they had the Temple Mount, it was pretty easy to go take the lower city. Now remember, height is everything in military battles. So the higher you are, you can rain down your arrows and whatever on the people below, particularly if they're people in Jerusalem that didn't have as many defenses as the Romans had offenses. So it was pretty easy to, this order of, once they got the Antonia Fortress, it's pretty easy to take the Temple Mount and then the lower city. And then next up, they took the upper city by breaching, coming from the Temple Mount, and then the first wall. This is what it looks like today. You can remember this morning I talked about the burnt chamber. That's something I recently found, is from the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. This is the burnt house. It's different. You go about 30 feet underground and see this house that's actually the remains of a house that was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. It's the only place that they found the remains of a person. They found the remains of a forearm of a woman that had been killed in the destruction of Jerusalem. This house was a rich person's house. It was a priest by the name of Catros, I believe. But this person was a priest in Jerusalem, and his daughter, I guess, they said she was maybe 25, 28 years old or something like that. Her forearm was found, so the destruction was pretty brutal. They found a spear in the house, a Roman spear, and of course we talked about the destruction on top of the Temple Mount that they pushed the stones over the wall. You remember the shops on the lower side of on the southern wall of the Temple Mount I talked about? I said, remember this as we go? This is the southern wall. These are the arches that used to be a shop. You can see the intensity of the fire that burned in Jerusalem when they burned all these shops. Can you see that arch there? There's another one here. And of course, to the victor of the spoils. I meant to get it and bring it up here, but I forgot before coming up here tonight. But I have Tyrian shekels. Tyrian shekels were required, shouldn't leave my clicker up there. Tyrian shekels were required by the temple priest for payment of the temple tax. Every Jewish male who was 20 years old and older had to pay the temple tax. And they required Tyrian shekels because they were very pure, like 90% pure silver. And they were consistently pure. When they minted shekels, they were always 90% silver. So the priest required that to be paid for the temple. That's why you had the money changers. People didn't carry around Tyrian shekels with them. They had pruta, they had denarii, they had grams from the Greeks. They had all this different kinds of money. Money is a really complex subject. I started to write a little section on money and ended up writing a whole chapter on money. So they had all this money, and that's what the purpose of the money changers was. And I think Jesus' problem with them was that they were charging people just outrageous prices for converting this money. But it was actually a valid function that they were doing. So anyway, I digress. So Tyrian shekels I meant to bring up here, but please go back and see the Tyrian shekels. They're very rare. You don't see many Tyrian shekels today. I have a full shekel, and I have a half shekel. A half shekel is required of the temple tax for every Jewish male above age of 20. Now, the temple, when the Romans took it, probably had millions of these Tyrian shekels in there. I mean, they've been gathering temple tax for decades and hundreds of years, bringing this money in. What are they doing with it? Well, they're storing it in the temple. They didn't have banks back then. You're storing it in the temple. So when the Jews came in and took the temple, they took all these Tyrian shekels, these pure, 90% pure Tyrian shekels, and they melted them down and turned them into denarii. And denarii, what was the Roman currency? They used denarii to pay their soldiers. They used denarii to build the Colosseum in Jerusalem. They used denarii to build the Arch of Titus in, not Jerusalem, but in Rome. The Jews built the Colosseum in which they were later put to death. Same with Christians. They would be mocked in gladiator games. They would be torn apart by wild animals. There were so many different ways that they killed Jews and Christians in the Colosseum. Well, who built that Colosseum? Well, the Jews built it from their Tyrian shekels that were melted down into denarii. I have Tyrian shekels back there. I also have denarii. You can see the difference in those. The Arch of Titus, we see a relief inside the Arch of Titus. See right there is the menorah, the 7-branch candlestick. That's the Roman soldiers carrying off the implements of the temple when they destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. Rome's campaign of AD 71 through 73 was basically a mop-up operation. They took several fortresses, Herodium, Machaerus, Masada. I wish I had time. I could talk a whole lesson on the fall of Masada. Some of you are probably familiar with it. There's been a bunch of movies written about it because it's really a fascinating story. That the Jews, 960 some odd Jews, killed themselves instead of being allowed to be taken slavery, captive, or killed by the Romans. They killed themselves. Interesting story. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, go to Masada today and say, never again. That's one of their stands where they get their pins or whatever, I don't know. But they say, never again. They say that on Masada. We're not going to let that happen again. And they don't. They're very, very good with their defense. So anyway, mop-up operations, AD 71 to 73. And now I want to talk about some cycles in history. So this morning we talked about a cycle of hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times, that cycle. We talked about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We talked about the good men of the Maccabees, and then it's led into the weak men of the Hasmoneans. And of course, Salome Alexander was actually pretty good. And then, of course, the weak men, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, both appealed to Rome for help in their civil war against each other, two brothers, one a Pharisee, one a Sadducee, we talked about this morning. And Rome came in and took over, and we went back to hard times in AD 63 when Pompey took over. Next up, we see cycles in the Old Testament. My best example is the book of Judges. In Judges, we see a cycle of sin, and then God allowed them to serve the nations around them, and then they repented. And then a judge came along, and they were given salvation, and they had a period of rest until, guess what, they sinned again. And the cycle started over again and over again and over again, all the way down. That's the Old Testament. In modern days, we have something called the Tytler cycle of civilizations. This is interesting and terrifying. And I'll tell you why it's terrifying. When you talk about cycles in history, you can have very small cycles. We can have just a cycle tonight. I can have a bad time, I could trip and fall out there or something, and then I get better, and really what I'm saying. But you can also have very big cycles. So you have smaller cycles and side cycles and side cycles. But if you look at the history of the United States, we were under bondage to England, right? Taxation without representation, all this kind of stuff. And along came some very brave men who had faith, and oh boy, I can't believe my chart's messed up, and they had courage, and they were willing to fight for their beliefs. George Washington, all of our founding fathers, they were there to fight for their beliefs. And then we get liberty, good times, and then we get abundance, right? Good times. And then our focus turns to material things, unfortunately, selfishness, self-absorption, complaining. My phone, that's the only thing I'm interested in. I don't care what you're doing. I don't care about anything but my phone. I got to check my text message. I got to check my email. I got to see what this website's doing, what Taylor Swift is up to, whatever it happens to be. Selfishness, complacency, apathy. Let somebody else do it. Something bad's going on. Let somebody else take care of it. That leads to dependence and then leads back to bondage. And that's the point of no return. That's the point at which no systemic change can help. It's going to take brave men or brave women to come along and break that cycle of bondage. Unfortunately, there are many, many examples of this cycle. The Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, etc., all the way down. Now, a lot of these places still exist, like Rome still exists, but the Roman Empire does not. The British still exist. They're some of my favorite people. I did a lot of international traveling and training of people. The Brits, some of my favorite people to talk to when I did that. They still exist as a nation. They still exist as London is a city. You've been there just a while back. Been to London a couple of times, and it still exists, but it's no longer an empire. But their empire started crumbling around 1947 to 50, where India went independent. Their currency started being, we were on a reserve currency of the pound sterling back in the mid-20th century. But the dollar supplanted that. Remember, there was this agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia that if you'll price your oil in dollars, we will protect you. And by that agreement, we became the reserve currency of the world. And because of our deep bond market and that kind of thing, we have continued to be the reserve currency of the world. And the British pound sterling still exists, but it's not a reserve currency anymore. That's a pretty important thing. I don't know how many of you in here are economists or whatever, but that's a pretty important thing. So all these average together, 238 years. We are 248 years and counting. Is that scary to anyone? Let me tell you what's going on in the world. BRICS. Anybody heard of BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and they've added about 20 more nations. I've not kept up with how many nations. UAE, I'm very familiar with. I've been over there several times. UAE is part of BRICS now. They have just announced their unit of currency called the unit. It's going to be based on gold and another other basket of currencies. The unit, mark my words, will probably supplant the dollar as the reserve currency of the world in some time. Now, the British pound sterling didn't go out, boom, just all of a sudden. It was a gradual process when the British pound sterling was phased out and the US dollar became the reserve currency. It'll probably be the same thing. I'm getting too political here, and I apologize for that, but I think that the unit will probably take over the US dollar at some point in the future. So the question is our time coming? Where are we in the cycle today? We've had some hard times in our life, right? World War II, the attack on the World Trade Center, the Cold War, the Depression. We've had some strong men. I put a Democrat up here and a Republican up here so no one could yell at me afterwards. Fair and balanced, I guess. Good times. My question is, have they come and gone? Are we at the end of the good times? Weak men and weak women. We see a lot of things going on, anti-Christian movements. We see a lot of anti-Semitism going on. We see a lot of abortion, for example. There's some advocate for abortion up until the 9th month and even after the baby is delivered that we've seen in the news. Weakly enforced laws. We see the promotion of dozens and dozens of genders and pronouns and things like that. Are we looking at weak men or women leading us to hard times again? Are we in for a recession? Are we in for a war? Are we in for whatever? A terrorist attack, Christian persecution? I don't know. Possibly. Why do we think we're immune to this kind of thing? We're just another cog in the wheels of history, right? Abraham Lincoln said this, pretty cool. He said, "Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up against us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher." Abraham Lincoln was a pretty smart guy. My question is, where are we in the cycle today? If we study history just because it's interesting, we have lost the purpose and missed the point. Now, I'm a historian. I'm not by training, but I'm a historian because of my hobby. But if I study just because it's interesting, we've lost the purpose. As someone once said, history may not repeat, but it often rhymes. This morning's lesson was about personal character. We looked at the Pharisees and how they compared to us. Tonight's lesson has been about national character. And we looked at some specific men, Albinus, Felix, Festus, and we've seen how these men's character affected the national character of their time. I strongly believe, I hope you do too, that we must latch on to the national character on which our nation was founded, the Judeo-Christian beliefs and principles. I am concerned that we may be in for a jarring rhyme of history if we don't. But it starts with us. The character of a nation's people makes the character of the nation. But if we're selfish, like these men we studied tonight, Albinus, Felix, and they're just in it for the money, they're just in it for the fame, they're in it for the power, whatever, if we're selfish like these people, then we're doing our little part to contribute to the national downward cycles. Selfishness destroys lives. Selfishness destroys relationships. Selfishness will destroy the nation if we let it. But it all starts with us. We've seen it tonight. We've seen what can happen. History does repeat. It certainly rhymes. We're living it now. My opinion, we need to turn it around. There's nothing special about the U.S. as far as history goes. It doesn't care. But we need to be a people of character and build up the nation into a nation of character. Now, tonight's lesson hasn't been about Christianity per se. We haven't been about baptism and those kinds of things. But we do have the opportunity tonight, if you happen to be here and you feel like you could be a better character, if you think about the lesson we had this morning and compare yourself to the Pharisees and how your character relates to that, and the scathing indictment that Jesus did of the Pharisees in Matthew, or if you're looking at the character of the nation and you think maybe your character is not contributing to the character of the nation, then we can talk to you about that. We can pray with you, pray for you. Or if you're not a Christian and you would like to be baptized tonight, won't you do so while we stand and sing?